I just wanted to say a couple of thank yous. First of all, Yohanan, thank you very much indeed for making yourself available today. And really not just for today, but you've been a great friend to BICOM over the years. From when you served in the Knesset as a member of Knesset with the Kadima party, you regularly met our delegations, and you always gave fantastic briefings. So thank you very much for that. And of course, you've continued to do so with the Democracy Institute. And a second thank you under your leadership of the IDI. We've had the benefits of lots of your experts as well, that we've also been able to partner with BICOM. Just last week, I interviewed one of your colleagues, Dr. Amir Fuchs, to talk through some of the legal issues. So we very much appreciate your leadership and kind of the role that the IDI has played in explaining Israeli politics and the interface between the politics and the legal establishment in these very important and difficult times. So just for today, in terms of framing for your briefing, we're obviously this evening we're expecting the government to be sworn in, and I think it would be most useful to hear from you today, kind of the background to the formation of the government, what you think the priorities and the main guidelines of the government will be, and some of the major challenges that it faces as well. Over to you. Thank you.
Well, so thank you, David and Richard. And thanks for having me. And as Richard mentioned, it's a long-standing relationship with BICOM. Ever since I became member of Knesset in 2006, I've been seeing BICOM delegations and trying to collaborate with the BICOM initiative. So keep up the good work, and hopefully we will be able to continue to assist both substantively and by also improving the base product, which is the State of Israel. I'll share now a presentation, if it's okay, and then that would make it easier for you to follow my comment. Is that, hold on. Yep, so that's, so yeah, what I thought of covering is tonight a new government is expected to be sworn in. You know, until it's actually sworn in, we can just treat it as a high likelihood. But some of us still remember 1990 when Peres comes to swear in his government with his wife sitting on the veranda there in the Knesset, and then two ultra-Orthodox members of Knesset broke the line, and there went the Peres' government, and Shamir got the chance to form his own government. So we still don't have a government, but it's very likely that within a few hours, the longest political crisis in the country's history, a year and a half of crisis, will be including 3 consecutive election campaigns, complete paralysis in the national level decision making. Hopefully all of that will be over within a few hours. All of this is happening in the context of the corona, the COVID-19 crisis. Health-wise, some of you also live here in Israel. We're seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. Economically, it seems like we're just at the beginning of probably the deepest recession that the country has experienced. Unemployment went up from 3% just in the beginning of March to 2 months ago to around 27% right now, and the extent of the economic implications is still largely unknown. Democratically, COVID-19 had far implications, and politically, which is what we're going to mainly cover. So health-wise, we can rank the government's overall response as successful and effective. The shutdown was immediate. Israel is in many ways an island state with 1/4 of entry, the Ben Gurion airport, and it was probably the most critical decision that was made was a shutdown, first from China and the East, later on from a few places in Europe, and then overall a shutdown which probably led to the low number of deaths. And now we are beyond the peak of the crisis, and the number of infected Israelis is dropping daily. The overall number is around 250 deaths, which is not only in absolute terms, but also proportionally is, if we compare to other countries, is considered a very low number. Economically, though, like other countries in Europe, North America, and other places in the world, we've been hard hit. 27% unemployment. Many of them are in leave of absence or a temporary leave, but many of those will not actually return to their workplaces. Small businesses and self-employed are the hardest hit because our social safety networks are not properly designed to safeguard their economic livelihoods, and it's not designed to deal with the crisis of this magnitude. Obviously, like in other countries, tourism, culture, leisure sectors are directly hit. Among the unemployed, there's a large portion of under 35 and more women than men, and generally the lower earning echelons of our economy. So our economists here at IDI, my vice president is the former governor of the central bank, Professor Karnit Flug, and we have a very talented and experienced group of economists that are working closely with the finance ministry and with the professionals of government that are shaping the economic policy. So our economists are projecting that by end of 2020, a big chunk of the unemployed will return to work. From over 1 million, about 500,000 will return, but we're still expecting by the end of the year, within half the year, a double-digit employment, which is equal to probably the highest recessions that we had during the peak of the second intifada. It was the highest, was around 11%. So now in half a year, once things dramatically improve, we will reach the lowest level that we've been through during the second intifada. So that just gives us an idea about the scope of the crisis. And hopefully schools that are began to gradually open within a couple of weeks will be fully up and running. The economic impact of flattening the curve, we have some estimates here of loss of GDP, and both in terms of percentages and overall numbers of billions of shekels, and it's obviously a very grim outlook. From a democratic perspective, how did the corona crisis and handling the crisis, how did it affect our democratic sphere? Well, initially there was an attempt there was quite a widespread use of emergency orders, emergency decrees that were based on mandatory laws. A British law from 1940. So again, that's a nice contribution from the UK. And there was an inflationary use of emergency decrees even when they were not necessary. Here at IDI, we have done some extensive work in analyzing them and then working with various some politicians in the Knesset, in Justice Ministry, and so on, to make sure that only that emergency decrees are used only when absolutely necessary and for temporary periods of time, and rather than just allowing the crisis to help transform our government into a government that is run by emergency decrees and annulling or subverting the authority of other institutions. So there was some attempt to shut down the Knesset by an interim government in some kind of a midnight decision, but those attempts were thwarted. And I think that we're sort of beyond that element. I mean, there was some point where there might have been over use and reliance on that crisis in order to undermine our democratic institutions. But I think now we're in a better place. Even the cell phone surveillance, which some of us at IDI thought is a reasonable move, but we ensured that it would have the proper judicial oversight, parliamentary oversight, and once those constraints are in place, some of those technological tools, it would be perfectly reasonable to use them. Obviously, only for the period of the crisis, and later on all the data needs to be deleted, and those measures need to be unwound. Politically, now we're moving to our main subject. The crisis obviously found Israel, or the Corona crisis, Israel after almost a year and a half of a political crisis, 3 election campaigns. The political pundits and the public were extremely tired of that crisis, and the Corona crisis and its economic implications also, to some extent, sapped the logic or the legitimacy from continuing that crisis. So that Netanyahu, the way he handled the crisis and used primetime media for his advantage, actually added to his increased his options because it increased his popularity, and therefore the default option of a 4th election looked quite lucrative to Mr. Netanyahu and looked quite threatening to his opponents, mainly blue and white. So that made them more willing to compromise, and obviously it also, while it created quite an appealing option to Mr. Netanyahu, being the seasoned politician that he is, he also realized that taking a country into an election with 27% unemployment can end up in a very different place than where you start, because it's a situation that we haven't experienced. So to some extent, it pushed both. It provided public legitimacy to make concessions and to violate campaign promises. It pushed Netanyahu to make concessions because he wanted to avoid the uncertainty of elections under circumstances of a pandemic. And it also caused Gantz to compromise, because blue and white in many ways reached its peak, found it very difficult to build consensus within, and Gantz was fearful of Netanyahu getting an absolute majority in a 4th election campaign. Netanyahu gained as a result of this national unity government coalition deal. He was managed again to disintegrate the main opposition that he was facing, blue and white, which is an alternative ruling party that was created for the first time in a decade since Kadima in 2009. It was extremely difficult to create a centrist or center-left option, and once it was created, Netanyahu effectively managed to undermine it, not only undermine blue and white as the main outfit that led the opposition, but also to drive a wedge between the different parties that made up the coalition, the opposition, that for the first time, a very unique opposition, bringing Lieberman from the right and more legitimacy to the Arab parties, you can say, from the left. For the first time, there was a real bloc that was competing with the ultra-Orthodox and right-wing bloc on the majority. And actually, this bloc, although it wasn't very cohesive and couldn't agree on forming a government, had a majority for 2 consecutive election campaigns. So Netanyahu managed to drive a wedge within blue and white and within that just not Bibi bloc, and that's again a proof of his political skills and his ability also to convert his popularity within his base, or among about half of Israelis, to convert it into political achievement. The Labour Party became now irrelevant and to some extent was swallowed by blue and white. Lieberman, although he's no longer kingmaker, he rebranded himself, and now there's a new brand in Israeli politics of a secular right-wing party that no longer is willing to accept the deal that being right-wing in Israel means also, by definition, capitulating to the ultra-Orthodox monopoly and demands on domestic affairs. So that's yet to be seen how the Lieberman rebranding will affect Israeli politics, but that's an event that is still rolling and happening. And as I mentioned, there was a beginning, an interesting process of legitimization of the Arab parties. And to some extent, this process was now suspended or halted, but it's an interesting process that will have long-term implications again on our politics. Mr. Bennett has now found himself thrown under the Netanyahu bus, and this will drive the government to a more mainstream policy, because Bennett will and Shaked will no longer sit in the government and challenge the Likud from within. This is just a reminder of the election outcome. And this is a very interesting slide. We're not going to focus on it too much, but it shows to what extent Israeli politics is stagnant. You see the 49, the red figure with 49 for the Israeli right. It shows how basically there isn't much movement between the blocs. And just in the past couple of election campaigns, the Lieberman's yellow color shows that if Lieberman plus the right wing today adds up again to 49. So the fact that Lieberman shifts sides is a dramatic structural change in Israeli politics, and otherwise nothing dramatic has changed, and we're seeing that pretty much Israeli politics is divided into 4 blocks: Arab, ultra-Orthodox, right-wing, and center-left, and the movement between them is very limited. That's why legitimization of Arab politics is a dramatic issue, and movement of Lieberman from one side to the other is also dramatic. We spoke about the calculation. Netanyahu is gaining, as a result of this government, legitimacy to serve in office, although he has been indicted. This is quite dramatic. Just 2 years ago, even Dudi Amsalem, the most confident, loyal person to Netanyahu within the Likud, said that when a prime minister cannot serve under an indictment. And Netanyahu, within 2 years, managed to basically, I don't know if to persuade or to instill a reality whereby it's acceptable for a prime minister to serve under an indictment, and this government that will be sworn in tonight will sort of label this Netanyahu achievement. By the way, Dudi Amsalem is spoken of as the next ambassador to the UK, so have fun. Now, he wasn't one of the most promising and impressive politicians, but perhaps he will make a reasonable ambassador. Netanyahu, on the other hand, is paying a price. He was hoping to legislate an immunity bill. He was hoping to nominate the next state prosecutor or next attorney general that will let him off the hook with an easy deal, and none of that will happen. So while Netanyahu was legitimized, he gave up on all of those hopes, and he will have to stand and try like any other citizen. And in this respect, no side is getting the whole package. Netanyahu made a compromise in comparison to his initial hopes and aspirations, and so did Gantz. Gantz, on the one hand, is able to protect the rule of law. There's no immunity. He insisted on gaining control over the Justice Ministry, and the next Justice Minister will be from Gantz's party, and he will lead the process of nominating the next state prosecutor immediately, and the next state attorney general within a year, and they will control the Justice Ministry, and he will chair the government legislative committee, which means we can expect an end to anti-democratic and populist legislation that was designed in order to various loyalty bills and bills that were designed to undermine the independence of the judiciary, and so on. So we can expect an end to that. Gantz also enters the government, although with far fewer MKs, only 19 in his bloc versus 54 in Netanyahu's bloc, but they created parity safeguards and mutual veto arrangement that basically allow Gantz to completely have absolute influence alongside with Mr. Netanyahu on the government's agenda. So except for the annexation issue that was excluded from that mutual veto arrangement, all other issues can be vetoed either by Gantz or Netanyahu, which means that we cannot expect some sort of extreme legislation coming out of this government. We should be fearful of paralysis, because if they're not able to live up to the moment and agree on much required economic reforms and other legislative initiatives, they can just end up vetoing each other, and we will basically experience a continued political crisis in other means. Rather than being manifested in consecutive election campaigns, it will be manifested in mutual veto powers in a government that doesn't make any decisions. I hope that will not be the case, but there's some fear that that will be the case. I hope that at least in the economic and security areas where there isn't much difference between the two blocs, they will actually be able to come together and promote the country's both economy and the country's security. This is I'm just sharing with you a public opinion. What do Israelis think about the new government? So do they expect this government, with all of its awkwardness and with its bloated nature and uninspiring agreement, or a fourth election? And we see 57% support for this government versus 27% support for a fourth round of an election. Of course, one might say, well, there might be another option. My political take, at least my judgment, the only two real options were either a fourth election or something that pretty much looks like this government. And I belong to the 57% that, in my view, this is a very crooked coalition agreement, an extremely uninspiring and to some extent even embarrassing government, but it's a far better option than continued economic crisis or continued political crisis with all of the downsides. Again, as I mentioned, some of the highlights, quote unquote, of the coalition agreement, or some of the drawbacks: it legitimizes a prime minister on an incumbent prime minister on trial, and in this respect, it impedes and thwarts the fight against corruption, and symbolically, from an educational perspective, it's bad news. The fact that we have a prime minister who's has been charged with such severe crimes and continues to manage the affairs of state. So this is, again, one of the drawbacks of this government. A bloated government. This is the most bloated government in our history. 34 ministers, as opposed to, with an option of making it 36, as opposed to 18 ministers in the 1996 government. So when he first came into power, he swore he introduced a government of 18 ministers, and now it's double the amount. Just to give you an idea, if we compare the number of ministers in Israel to a whole lot of democracies that are of similar size by and large, like the Scandinavian countries and others, we compared it to about 10 or 15 other functioning European democracies. All of them, the number of ministers in proportion to the size of the parliament, say in Israel we have 120, and the number of ministers will be around 32 to 34. it's anywhere between 26 to 30%. The equivalent ratio in all other countries is between 6% and 11%. So it's anywhere between 2.5 times to 3 times the amount of ministers than in all other functioning European democracies that are equivalent to Israel. So it's both ineffective, wasteful, symbolically bad, but also very, very costly. An analysis that we at IDI made, we actually created a proposal for 70 ministries-based government alongside with the budget department and the treasury. We relied on data that they supplied us, and it was a joint initiative. And we demonstrated that if we move from the current situation of 29 ministries, not talking about ministers, but rather ministries, we have 29. If we move down to 17, it will save us about 800 million shekels a year. If we look at an entire government term of 4 years, and now they're creating actually more ministries, it will be more than 29. So it's around 1 billion shekel per year. So it's not only a symbolic issue, it's real money. And for those of us who are paying taxes, it's, I must say, quite aggravating. The fact that we have a dual prime minister, as I mentioned, might introduce or might produce a recipe for paralysis. It's also an entire sort of regime mechanism has been created by political wheelers and dealers sitting and sort of reinventing our constitutional arrangement and inventing an office of alternate prime minister that can veto the entire government agenda. So again, this is another one of the problems, and I think also the fact that the opposition was weakened. Traditionally, the opposition was chairmanship of significant committees like the Economics Committee. One of the slots in the committee that selects judges was allocated to the opposition. These norms were violated, and it's unfortunate news about that coalition agreement. We mentioned the number of ministers. Again, there's here a comparison. So again, the highest number of ministers in our country's history, 34. It might even mushroom to 36. The highest number until then was 30 in Netanyahu's government in 2009. And again, if you look at this chart, in 96 was Netanyahu's first government, it was 18. Rabin's government in 92 was 17 ministers. But and Ben Gurion's first government was 12 ministers. So there's something to aspire towards. Again, now the upsides, the positives of this government, at least in my mind and in my analysis, but I think also that I don't think, from conversations with Gantz and his close advisors, one of their motivations for entering the government was achieving a democratic ceasefire. So, as I mentioned before, a halt to dangerous anti-democratic initiatives. Here at IDI, we counted almost 70 such initiatives of the past government between 2015 and 2020. Many of them were of quite the dramatic nature. The vast majority was suspended and halted, and a small portion, about 6 or 7, did pass, but in a diluted nature. But if Netanyahu in a fourth election would have had, an absolute majority in the Knesset, it would be reasonable to expect that wave of anti-democratic and anti-constitutional initiatives would have been reinstated. And this government is creating a ceasefire in this area. Will it be able to proactively now reach broad understanding in, say, constitutional areas? So probably the most important agreement that I hope this government will be able to achieve. I'm not sure it will be able to do that. I'm sure that we will have a democratic ceasefire, not I hope that the tainted discourse and the negative anti-democratic initiatives will be brought to a halt. will the government proactively be able to create a legislation that will regulate the process of legislating basic laws, which is our version of constitutional changes? I hope that this will be the case, because the current reality that a simple majority of 61 can legislate basic laws and basically legislate far-reaching constitutional changes without any safeguards renders our democracy extremely fragile. And since we saw that reckless politics can endanger our democracy, I really hope that this national unity government will proactively strengthen the constitutional nature of our governing regime. So again, this is an opportunity, and we very much see it as our role to push in that direction and advocate for it and educate the relevant actors in this direction. When it comes to religion and state, the ultra-Orthodox parties are in the government, very closely allied with Mr. Netanyahu and the Likud. So there's little chance for reform and liberalization in conversion, Shabbat, marriage, or equal allocation for non-Orthodox streams of Judaism and their religious services. None of that is going to happen. Israel, assuming this government will complete its 3 or 4 year term, Israel is not expected to be more liberal and democratic, but it also will not be less. Like it's also in the religion and state area, we expect a kind of a ceasefire, except for the recruitment issue, where a major concession was already made, and the recruitment arrangement was rendered completely void of content, and the ultra-Orthodox are gaining an absolute exemption from service, and in this respect, risking the entire service model of the IDF. So this is something that a concession that was already made. Socio-economically, we mentioned that the government has a broad parliamentary base. Those issues are not wedge issues. Economic reform, changing our public services, removing some of the liabilities and allowing, opening up our economy and allowing for growth while creating social solidarity, stronger professional training schemes, and so on. Much required economic reform. There's an opportunity for it. Those are not politically defining issues. There's a broad parliamentary base. There's a crisis that renders it a necessity, and hopefully, at least in this area, we will see major achievements, much like the national unity government we had in the mid-80s, where Peres and Shamir together thwarted the hyperinflation and put our economy on a trajectory of growth for decades. So this is here. There's a real opportunity, and the quality of the leadership of the two main leaders, Gantz and Netanyahu, will be measured on whether they are able to make use and utilize this opportunity. Security and diplomacy-wise, on the main issues of Iran, Syria, Iran's presence in Syria, Hezbollah's presence in Syria, Hamas, on all of those issues, the truth is that the main line and priorities and policies are set by the defense establishment and its institutions, mainly the IDF, Mossad, Shin Bet, and so on. And here, I don't expect any deviation from past policies, and I don't expect major differences. The areas that might be more loaded politically are area of settlement expansion, where I expect less expansion of of remote settlements or some construction within existing settlements, because Gantz controls defense, and the Justice Ministry is also controlled by Blue and White. So the unauthorized posts and all of those kinds of endeavors will have a less favorable government behind them. And then we're remaining with the issue of annexation. Annexation, the whole issue of annexation was excluded from the mutual veto powers of the coalition agreement. So a sort of a circumvention path was created for annexation, and assuming Mr. Netanyahu would want to bring it to the table for decision making within the window of opportunity that was defined, which is between July and October. July is the earliest because that's what the agreement stipulates, and October because after that there's the U.S. election campaign, and assuming if there's a change of administration, the annexation issue will be off the table. So there's a window of opportunity, and if Netanyahu decides to push it forward, then he can go directly to the Knesset and try and build a majority there with some MKs of blue and white, perhaps with Lieberman, perhaps with Bennett, and so on. So there's a natural majority for annexation, but again, it depends on many constraints. The most important constraint, will the U.S. veto it or not? If the U.S. doesn't go along, then it's the end of this game. If the U.S. does agree, there's still the Europeans, there's still the Egyptians, and mainly the Jordanians. Gantz controls the defense establishment, and if the defense establishment will sound a clear voice against it, it might have an influence. Ashkenazi, Gantz's partner, controls the foreign ministry, and they might also have their qualms. And of course, when we speak of annexation, there's a major difference about of scope, and nobody knows whether it will be limited, symbolic annexation, say of Ma'ale Adumim or something in Gush Etzion, or an all-out annexation of all settlements. In my eyes, this issue might just become a wedge issue that Netanyahu will use in order to fire up the base and differentiate himself politically and neutralize the some of the criticism from Bennett's party, so it can be used as a political issue without actually going for the final move in the Knesset voting on it, but just keeping it live on the agenda and perhaps winking to the Americans and asking them to veto it publicly or something. I see that as the most likely option. And otherwise, if something will be brought to the Knesset, I can't see anything more than some symbolic gesture of, some limited symbolic gesture that will not create any significant changes on the ground. So although, but those are assessments, it's yet to be seen, and for that we will have to wait for July, and perhaps the discourse will begin even earlier than that. Again, this is support for annexation. Again, it's a very ambiguous term, and therefore I would associate limited importance to those numbers. And again, Israelis also will very much be wary and try to understand what are the implications and the prices, because if you just say, do you support annexation without a clear price to be paid, then it's one thing, but the opposition, say from the Europeans, perhaps opposition with implications, strong wording from the defense establishment about implications with Jordan, all of these things can make a difference. So I think those numbers give you an indication, but it's still an initial stage. So in conclusion, we're ending a year-and-a-half political crisis. This government that will be created is nobody's dream and nobody's vision. It's almost like a ceasefire after a war, where you have the generals of both sides meeting in some tent, and both of them are tired and full of dirt, and agreeing on some awkward lines that they never imagined. This is the case. The Israeli public is not happy about some of those arrangements. The politicians are not. Nobody's getting their whole deal. But that's what politics is about. It's about making compromises and moving on. And although it's a very upsetting deal, again, at least it's a deal, and we can move forward, and the state can run, and we can immediately go and pass a budget. The current budget that based on it we are running the affairs of state was passed in late 2017. We're now in mid 2020. It was passed in late 2017 as a biannual budget for 18 and 19, and since the beginning of 20 we are running on a residual budget. So we can pass a much desired and required budget that will be based on a broad parliamentary base, And there's actually a chance that this government, after a long political crisis that really tainted the environment and created, to some extent, also much sort of domestic hatred between the different groups, that was in many ways unnecessary, because the ideological differences between us here in Israel are not that great, but the heat between the blocs was tremendously high. So I hope that this unity government will create an opportunity both for reforming the economy, for moving on, and for introducing more conciliatory rhetoric and policy domestically. So those are the comments that I prepared, and now we can, David, Richard, we can open it up for a conversation.